Hello, everybody. This is JJ Hardy with Victory Leadership Coaching. JJ Hardy, the coach. And I'm here with DB, the therapist, the man, the myth, the legend. We're here on another episode of Warrior Leadership. And today is the second episode in our 4-part series of emotional intelligence. And today, first of all, last week we talked about self-awareness, which if you go directly from the pillars of emotional intelligence, started off with recognizing your own emotions and understanding how they influence your actions. And if you want to know more about that, you're going to have to fish through the videos and look for that last week. If you like this week, please do, because we need the awareness. However, this week we're talking about self-regulation. And because we have DB, the therapist, in the house, I'm going to get his point of view on that before I say another word.
Oh, man. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. So,
of course,
emotional regulation. It's interesting. You know, I think sometimes when working with people, I think they get into these spaces where they feel like they cannot manage their emotions or their emotions are going to overwhelm them. And there are definitely strategies to help you stay in the resilience zone. And it's easy to get either when we go too high out of the resilience zone, we're going up towards like anxiety and anger. And when we dip below that resilience zone, we're going into depression. And so this idea, last week we talked about the awareness, which is the one pillar of that first block. Once we have that awareness, the ability to regulate is like that next step in the process. And, a lot of times when most often when we're experiencing that physiological response in our body, that will overwhelm all of our senses and we're no longer able to sort of regulate at that point. And so that's why awareness is so important. And then once we catch it, whether it's in the pit of our stomach or in our chest, wherever that's at, once we can access what we call like the universal thought or the stuck point, and we know what that is, that's what helps us to then regulate our emotions.
That's a good point. And, when we talk about self-regulation or emotional regulation, what that means to me is kind of keeping your mind right and making sure that you're not putting yourself and the people around you in a position where you're losing your credibility and losing the I will call it the hearts and minds of the people around you. When you cannot regulate your own emotion and you're that person that's known for being sporadic, maybe all over the place when it comes to emotion, and it's very difficult to be in the same room with you or have a conversation with you, your credibility is gone. You're not going to be able to create influence with other people because you don't even have control over yourself. And that's a big part of leadership. We're talking leadership coaching and therapy here. So a big part of that is making sure you get it's almost like making sure your house is clean before you go tell somebody else how to clean theirs. How are you supposed to lead by example if you're not taking care of yourself and regulating yourself first? Nobody's going to come to you. You've lost it. You're gone.
Right. And I want to touch on that too. Let me piggyback off of that for a minute, because that's a very interesting concept, because I think when you start talking, when you mention that, this idea of imposter syndrome comes up, right? And I think as human beings, I know myself, I'm definitely a perfectionist. And at those moments where, I do dip out of that zone of resiliency, because I'm human, right? I don't get it right 100% of the time. And I'm a therapist. And so if I dip out of that zone of resilience sometimes, it may get irritable or angry or have, sadness or depression for moments or for seasons, then I know those individuals who don't have the tools, they also dip out of that zone. And so I have to be very careful to not feed what I continue to repeat over and over again is that defectiveness schema, right? I think so many of us may have a defectiveness schema, and if we're not careful, we'll make one mistake and then we'll kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and we won't keep moving forward. And so even as a counselor, it's my responsibility. If I start to dip out of that zone, I need to do the things that are very important to help myself regulate my emotions, which are exercising, reading my word, eating healthy, seeking therapy myself, seeking coaching, using all of those tools in our tool belt to be able to regulate our emotions. And so we can talk about self-regulation a lot, but at the end of the day, it's self-regulation, but it also takes a community. And I think that's that important part about the wellness wheel. And coach, you and I both, we bounce ideas off of each other. That whole idea of iron sharpens iron. And I think that's the beauty of human connection. And when you're connected with someone else, you learn from each other. And there's this strategy or this tool that I use in therapy it's from dialectical behavioral therapy called Wise Mind. And every once in a while, you look at that Venn diagram, and over here you have emotions, and on this side you have you have logic. And every once in a while there'll be a situation that pushes us over to the emotional side. And when you communicate with someone else who you trust and who you have a relationship with, then that conversation will shift you more over to the center. And as we move over to the center, then we have that balance or that equilibrium that we need in order to really regulate our emotions. Because if we're too far over here to the left or too far to the right, we will not be able to regulate our emotions properly. And there is possible to have what we call emotional dysregulation. And so it's very important to not only self-regulate, but also bounce ideas off of each other. And we talked about this when we talked about tribes, right? It's so important to be a part of a larger community.
It is. Now, I'd like to add something to that. They say that when you are in a management, maybe higher, and you have a team working for you, you tend to do a lot of saving face. And so I want to touch on that for a second, because a lot of people don't feel like they can show that level of vulnerability with their team. And sometimes you can't. I'm just going to be quite honest with you. Sometimes you need to be the rock that's there for them. However, when you are in that position, it's very, very important to make sure that you are finding that person that you can talk to, that team that you can open up to, that activity that, maybe it's going out into the woods where nobody else is around, smelling that great, wonderful pine smell that people love in the outdoors, and just closing your eyes and doing some breathing exercises, or maybe screaming out loud. I don't know what it is. There are so many ways that you can regulate your emotions, but there's definitely some complications when you are that person that has a team and you need to keep it cool around your team. You got to make sure that you don't just stuff it down. You got to have an outlet.
Yes.
And if you don't have an outlet, then you're going to, honestly speaking, you're going to get to the point, even on your team or maybe at home with your family, if you keep tamping things down, that warm feeling, you're not going to be able to stop it anymore. It's going to end up just like we talked about last week. When you're aware of it, that awareness, that the amount of time that it takes for that explosion to happen is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And, I'm not using all the fancy words that old DB is over here is using, but this is real stuff. I'm speaking to the layman here, and and I'm not saying that you guys are idiots that are listening to this or nothing like that, but I am saying that you have to understand that bottling emotions up does nothing but put like a toxic sludge in your body that just gets thicker and thicker. And if you don't take care of it, if you don't have an outlet, if you don't have a spouse to talk to, or a good friend at work, or somebody that you can call a friend maybe and just say, hey, look, this BS just happened to me and I got to tell somebody about it, then you're setting yourself up for failure. You're setting your family, your team, whoever you're around all the time, you're setting them up for failure, and yourself as well, because you're going to lose your doggone mind.
Right. And thanks for that compliment, by the way, sir. Viktor Frankl, Viktor Frankl, he was you know who Viktor Frankl is?
Yes, I do. He was in a concentration camp. He wrote a book called The Things They Carried, I believe.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And he has this quote, man, where he says, between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom, right? And so when we think about this idea of like warrior leadership, right, and we think about emotional regulation, we all have that opportunity within every conflict to rise above it. And I think that what's very powerful sometimes in these situations where there's a heightened sense of emotion, although it's danger, there's also opportunity. And so, JJ, you really do a good job of always even reminding me of that, is that look for that opportunity, look for that small little gap where it's almost like a running back, right? You find that small little crease, and when you hit that crease, man, you're taking it to the end zone, right? And
yes.
So I think it's so important to just think about this emotional regulation. Just slow down, stop. Sometimes you got to slow read before you go forward, and you take some breathers, take some breaths. The simplest strategies that I talk about in therapy, some of the most simple things like breathing, mindfulness, writing, meditation, exercise, right? Those things seem very simple, but when anger is high and cognition is low, you don't think about doing those things. Those things go out the window. And by the way, those very basic interventions like that is what allows that time and space between decision and action before you're going to engage in an unhealthy maladaptive behavior. And so about this second pillar where it talks about choosing a healthy outlet, right? We have to choose something healthy, even if it means, you made a good point, if you want to go in the woods and scream and yell, it's probably better to do that than to yell at your loved one or say something that's going to be hurtful. And all of us have been guilty of that at times. I know I could raise my hand and be the first one to say that many of times I have failed and have raised my voice or allowed myself to miss the mark. And we're humans. And so I think, but what's also powerful is that if you look at yourself over time, right? And this is a very much a harm reduction approach. And mostly I'm speaking to men because that's who I work with in private practice, is that so many times they can go months and months and years without kind of having a blowout or making a mistake or engaging in something what we call maladaptive or a bad behavior. And then they can do something once. And then all of a sudden, JJ, I watch them literally regress all the way back to when they first started. And if you're not careful, you won't see the small wins in there or even the huge wins. Maybe you had a blow up, but it didn't last as long. And maybe you didn't say certain mean and hurtful things that you would have normally say, because we can really dig when we're in these intimate relationships with people. And so that's the one thing I will say too, just before I pass it back to you, is that when is the time where we're most likely to have a challenge in regulating our emotions? And I think it's important to know, like, what environment and what people are more likely to kind of bring out the bad guy, so to speak. In Scarface, right? He says, hello, welcome. Like, here I am, the bad guy. Like, what moments are going to trigger that? And I think that, again, that goes back to awareness, but that's when I know I really need to be engaging in some healthy behaviors. And so I'm curious, like, what are those moments for most people that you've noticed that, where they're more likely to be emotionally dysregulated?
Well, I think that's different for everybody.
Yes.
So I know that there are some people where that place could be maybe in a room where it's uncomfortable for them. Some people cannot be wrong. whether they are or not. They cannot be wrong. Those people, that unhealthy space for them is not having the emotional intelligence to bring themselves down and open their mind up. But it takes training to do that.
Yes.
So, you know, I always talk about get comfortable being uncomfortable. That is sometimes easier said than done. Those uncomfortable situations, when you push through those negative emotions that come out of being in those positive situations, that's where you grow. It's not called emotional intelligence because it's easy, just like anything else. You know, college is not easy. Learning something new is not easy. It's just not. Change is not easy. It's called emotional intelligence because you have to train yourself. You got to do the reps. You got to work at understanding these trigger points. You got to work at understanding, you know, where is it in that trigger where, you know, you get from here to here, and how long does it take to go from here all the way up to here to you going, you know, and doing all that kind of thing. Well, emotional intelligence, my gosh, I love the way it's worded, just the way you say it, because guess what the most unintelligent emotion is? It's anger. And, you know, it's really, really easy to blow up.
Yes.
It's really, really easy to just spout off at the mouth. It's really, really easy to let yourself go and let that downward spiral continue, not just in that conversation, but in your entire life. It starts there and saying something stupid somewhere.
Right.
But I think I've mentioned this before, the good old Andy Stanley thing. You know, once you take that wrong turn, it's followed by another and another and another and another and another. And before you know it, you're standing at the bottom of a hole and people are looking down at you like, you put yourself there, you freaking idiot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that doesn't mean you meant to, but, you know, once you start the wrong, not wrong, that's not the right thing to say. There are habits that you can get into that will lead you in a direction that is unhealthy.
There you go. I like that.
And if you don't recognize that it is unhealthy and that it is a path that's going to lead to destruction, then it's unfortunate. You need help. You gotta admit that there's a problem and then get help. That's why DB's in the house, and he has friends all over the country and the world, by the way.
Well, and you know, you made it. I like how you rephrase that idea of like right or wrong. It's really like effective and ineffective, right?
Yeah.
And I think when we look at it like that, and we reframe it, then we can kind of ask ourselves a question, right? You know, you think about being in the military and you know, this idea of being a warrior, right? We would say in combat, do you want to be combat effective or combat ineffective? And that's easy to answer, right? Nobody's going to admit and say, well, yeah, of course, I want to be combat ineffective. And well, in life is a battle. And at the biggest stage, do we really want to be combat ineffective? No, we want to be combat effective. And one way we do that is by, you know, ensuring that we're always being self-aware, we're always monitoring, and we're always learning and pivoting, right? And I think that kind of brings that's the second sort of aspect of emotional regulation, which is being able to adapt to changing circumstances. JJ, come on, coach. What is this idea about adapting to changing circumstances? What does that have to do with emotional regulation, and why is that so important?
Well, I'm going to go back to the same thing that I just got done talking about at the beginning, where I said you got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. You have to, life is that way. You're going to go into new situations all the time.
Yes.
People do not like change. There are people in the workplace right now that still think that you have to work somewhere for the same place for your entire life. And let me go ahead and tell those people, if you're listening, yes, you, and I don't even know that you're there, but I'm talking to you, you know, that's not the way the workforce is anymore. The way that the corporate and other business landscape is, you know, people, if they want to get promoted and make themselves better, they have to work at a job unless there's promotion opportunities within it.
Yes.
That, you know, they need to bounce around, and they don't just bounce around at the same level. They move up a little bit every time. And that's just one example. But, you know, when you get stuck in one mindset and you don't understand that everything is changing around you, it makes you weak. Honestly, there are some people out there that are just waiting for that dinosaur to retire.
Right.
And the reason that is, and that's not just, that's only one example. There are a myriad of examples. But if you don't adapt to your current situation, then you're missing out on opportunities for your growth, and you're not going to be able to fully affect change in your organization, and you're not going to be able to develop your people because you're stuck. Right. And it's now we talked about combat and ineffective or effective, right? How effective would we be if we went into a combat zone and we thought it was one way and it wasn't, and then we aren't fully prepared and we go out there and we just say, oh, shoot, I wasn't ready for that. I'm just going to give up. No, I'm sorry. It's not the way it works. And by the way, if it doesn't work in combat, do you really think outside of that, if you're just a regular Joe in the civilian world, that there's any situation that it's okay to just walk into and it's not what you expect and you just give up on it and you give up on yourself?
Right.
That's the mind of a warrior.
Right.
Adapt and overcome. I don't even remember which branch. I think that's the Marines. I think they're the ones who say that all the time. But guess what? That's what it takes to fight and win.
Yes. And
if you want to be a warrior, you can't be afraid of adapting. Yes. Because adapting is growing.
Yes. And the one of the greatest, leaders and coaches out there, man, John Maxwell, man, he said, change is inevitable. Growth is optional. And when we think about this intersection between coaching and therapy, I think the portion of that quote where it says change is inevitable, see, in that portion, that's where we start thinking about, fear, trauma, defectiveness, schema, low self-worth, self-esteem, all of the things that genuinely hold people back, right? These literally these, psychological, I would say psychological barriers that keep people from moving forward. But as they go through the therapy process and they start to develop a stronger sense of self and build up that self-worth and self-confidence, I think that's where they need to matriculate into coaching. And that's where the growth can happen. Growth can really happen outside of that office, where they go to the next step and they say, you know what? I'm tired of working at this company. I want to pursue that dream as an entrepreneur, or I want to go pursue that dream as a real estate agent. I no longer want to work in this field anymore. This field has served me for as long as it's going to serve me. And now I want to make that change and go to the next level. And when we're able to do that and able to connect to that coach, then that's where that growth can happen. But again, it said optional. And I think what's important about that is that even though it says optional, how many people, JJ, have we talked to where, they kind of stand at the water cooler, or, a better example is they want to jump in the water and they're standing at the edge of the water and they're like, it's too cold. And they're like, they're dipping their foot in there and they're trying to figure out how cold it is, but they really want to go in that water because they see everyone else having fun. And now all of a sudden there's this idea of jealousy and envy that starts brewing on the inside of a person. And that only keeps them stuck even more. And I think when you're able to just accept the fact that change is the law of life, and you go forward and you go after it, and this is something that you do a really good job of, JJ, in terms of coaching, getting people to take that first step after they've already dealt with all those negative thoughts and negative cognitions. I've watched you do it. I've seen you consistently sort of teach that. And that's so important, because you know what? Sometimes you do need that coach to stand there and say, okay, it's okay to jump now. It's okay to leap in here because the water is fine. And if you don't have that, then you're gonna be in your head, and you're gonna listen to those 50,000 negative thoughts that go through your head in a day, and you're likely not gonna jump. And so sometimes we can motivate ourselves and have that intrinsic motivation, but quite often, I would say most people, they need someone else to motivate them up front, to get them rolling and build up that momentum.
And that is definitely another part of emotional intelligence that I don't think we've touched on yet. And if we did, I don't remember it. But then again, I don't remember what happens day to day anyway. So, but there's that aspect of, the fear of failure, or, you just mentioned it, but the self-doubt, all that stuff going on in your head that keeps you from making that first step.
Mm-hmm.
Imposter syndrome. Sorry, I couldn't think of it. I could have rambled on and on and on forever, but it took me a second to think of that. But if you don't take that first step, then you don't know what's going to happen next. And a lot of people are bogged down. And we're kind of talking about goals, but this is still part of emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
You have to understand that a lot of this doubt, a lot of these things that you're bringing up in your mind, guess what? You made that up.
There it is.
Somebody else told you something.
Yes.
And then you believed it.
Yes.
Was that thing true?
No.
I don't know. How are you going to know if you don't lean forward in the foxhole and just try it anyway? Because you're not going to be any farther behind if you take a step forward. You might fall on your butt, but you're not going to be any farther back than you were. You're just going to learn that, well, shoot, that didn't work. Or on the other side of that, maybe it will. And then you'll find out something about yourself, and whatever situation you're in, you're going to learn something new about what you're doing, and how, maybe even a valuable life lesson, just because you didn't listen to a negative thought or some hater out there saying that you shouldn't do it because of A, B, C, D, and E.
Yep.
But you have to be smart enough to understand that a lot of that doubt just kind of comes out of the woodwork. It's made up. You believed something that you don't even know is true.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of emotional intelligence, my friend.
Yep. And, before we close, man, one of the tools that I actually provide for my clients is a 5-column thought record. And it's very important to take every thought into captivity. You take those thoughts and say it's a negative thought. And, it's one of those thoughts that lead to doubt. And you work through that with your therapist. You take that thought, and then it forces you to say, well, what's the emotion attached to that thought? And it's teaching you, it literally is a framework in which you can take a step back and really dissect every thought that is a defective one, and it's not the truth and doesn't suit you. And then you get to that last column where you're reframing it and you're coming up with a new thought. And that's where you get this idea of affirmations and a mantra, right? That's something that you guys can implement today. That's a practical strategy you can implement today. And just being able to really capture thoughts, it's so important. And when you can reframe them, that's how you grow, and that's how you can gain mastery over your emotions.
That's true. And I'm going through this with one of my children right now. You got to get rid of words like I can't. How do you know? You got to get rid of I don't know how. Well, learn how. What if? What if? You know, you got to all of these negative things that bog you down can actually be a positive if you turn it into a positive. It can make the impossible seem possible.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing that's standing between you and your success, or maybe that one person that might need help, is a thought that you can reframe, an action that you can take that you're not willing to try already. And we're at 30 minutes. So I will ask you, Mr. DB, the therapist, what message do you have for the audience before we close this out and I start saying my rambling speech about sharing it and all that fun crap?
Yeah, I can't wait for that part. That's the most exciting part of the podcast, man. But, you know, just real quick, it is possible to regulate your emotions. You're not going to get it right all the time, and it's okay. One of the best phrases that you use all the time is you can always course correct. So let's just course correct. Let's get back on track. Get back to using your tools. Don't feed into that self-defeating mindset. That's going to keep you stuck. You got to keep moving forward. So I think it's so important to know that emotions can be managed no matter how difficult they may feel. And again, feel, that's emotional reasoning when we look at an emotional state and believe it's always going to be that way. And so I just want to encourage everybody out there that it is possible to regulate your emotions.
That's right. Don't get caught in that self-fulfilling prophecy. Mm-hmm. All right. So we're at the end of this week's podcast. However, this is on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. If you like this, if the message resonates with you, then please like it, subscribe to it, share it, but more importantly, leave your comment below this video and keep the conversation going. And if you really, really feel like somebody could benefit from this message, then you have to share it with your audience. Because if you don't, you're cheating your friend, and don't cheat yourself. If you want to learn more, ask questions. Somebody, and I don't know who it is, but a Facebook user says, "It has taken me years. I don't know how Jesus did it." Amen, my friend.
Amen.
I know that's right. Thank you for saying that. That's really where all the problems are solved, is if you give it to God. So that's it. We'll see you guys next week. We're going to be on episode 3 of the 4-part series of emotional intelligence. And we're going to talk about empathy, which is going to be freaking amazing.
Oh my.
And that's all I got to say about that. Take care. God bless everybody.